So last week we started looking at different religions and how we might approach different religions with regard to apologetics. Most of what we've talked about in our apologetic study has been geared mainly to the atheist, the unbelieving atheist. And most of what will work, the arguments that you might make for the atheist, will still work for the other religions, maybe just slightly modified in different ways depending on which religion you're engaged with. So last week we started with Islam, and then I thought we would move on to Hinduism today. Linda Bassett expressed interest in Mormonism last week, and so we'll look at Mormonism, maybe a little bit of Jehovah's Witnesses. We may do both of those kind of at the same time. I'm not real sure. So last week, just for purposes of review, and I have some leftover handouts from last week if anybody wants one. It's got some quotes from the Quran, and essentially what last week's argument boiled down to is that if the Quran is true, the Bible is true. But since the Bible is true, the Quran is false. And I've got that as a quote in bold. That comes from Cy Ten Bruggencate. That's the apologist that we tried to watch his documentary, How to Answer the Fool. I think that's what it's called. But he's the one where I got this quote from, and it really is the best way to engage the Muslim, is just that one simple quote. If the Quran is true, the Bible is true, and because the Bible is true, the Quran is false. Now, what do I mean by that? The Quran teaches that Jesus is not the Son of God, and I've got a quote there out of the Quran. The Quran also teaches that Jesus was not crucified. So those are two fundamental areas of disagreement between Christians and Muslims. Jesus was not the Son of God, and he was not crucified. They teach that, or the Quran teaches that Jesus was not crucified. It was some other person, and some people say it was Judas that was actually crucified on the cross in place of Jesus. Jesus came as a prophet, said all that he said, but when it came time for the crucifixion, Allah made it look like Jesus was on the cross, but he wasn't actually on the cross. Somebody else was on the cross, and some teach that was Judas being made to look like Jesus. And so right there, that seems very odd for us, that God would be deceitful in that way, and to make people believe something that was just an outright lie. Jesus wasn't crucified. But here we all are, Christians, believing the thing that he made it look like happened didn't happen, if any of that makes sense. Muslims, when you engage a Muslim, the main thing that they're going to want to say to you as a Christian who keeps appealing to the Bible is, well, the Bible's been corrupted. The Bible's been corrupted. You can't trust what the Bible says. And so now I've got some quotes out of the Quran that says, number one, Allah's words cannot be altered, and that the Quran teaches that the Bible is from Allah. The Old Testament is from Allah, the New Testament is from Allah, and they were previous revelations from Allah. That's what the Quran teaches. And the Quran also teaches that we as Christians are morally obligated to judge things, to discern reality based on the Old Testament and the New Testament. So, as far as Allah is concerned, those revelations from Him are authoritative, they are inspired, and they are to be believed by the people group that those revelations were given to. So the Old Testament, the Jews should follow the Old Testament. We Christians should follow the New Testament according to the Quran. And that the Quran, that both of those revelations, the Old Testament and New Testament, are from Allah, and Allah's words cannot be altered. And so that's what you're going to be asking the Muslim is, if you believe the Quran, and the Quran teaches that those revelations are from Allah and His words cannot be altered, then why do you think that the Bible has been corrupted? If they're Allah's words and His words cannot be altered, how is it that they were corrupted? And so that's the entirety of the point. If the Quran is true in that it teaches that the Bible is the inspired revelation from God, and the Quran teaches that Jesus was not the Son of God, and the Quran teaches that Jesus was not crucified, but the Bible teaches the exact opposite, then we've got a contradiction between the two books. And the Quran tells us, Christians, that we are morally obligated to follow what the New Testament says. So if the Quran is true, the Bible is true. According to the Quran, the Bible is true. But since the Bible is true, the Quran must be false. Does that all make sense to everybody? Very, very simple apologetic tool that you now have if you ever are engaged in a conversation with a Muslim. If the Quran is true, then the Bible is true. But since the Bible is true, the Quran is false. That's the way you're going to be arguing for the Muslim. Okay, let's spend a little time on Hinduism. Has anybody ever looked into Hinduism? No? Probably be fair to say we don't know an awful lot about it. In my research, I wanted to know how many Hindus there might be in Oklahoma. Because I asked the question last week, how many people have a Muslim in their circle of people? And nobody here raised their hand. It doesn't come up a lot. And so you might think, well, Hindus, it's going to be even less. I don't know any Hindus. Went to school with a few Muslims, but I just don't have any personal acquaintances that are Hindus. I've never known any Hindus. I've seen Hindus in Oklahoma, but I don't know anybody that's Hindu. And so I'm just wondering, when would this come up for any of us? Well, it turns out, according to the research that I did over the last week, there's about 19,000 Hindus in Oklahoma. About 19,000. There is a giant Hindu temple just east of Coltrane, in between 63rd Street and Wilshire. Did anybody know that? Anybody familiar with that? There's a Hindu temple up in Tulsa. So you might run into a Hindu, and unless you know something about Hinduism, you're not going to know what to say as a Christian. And again, we're not just trying to beat up the Hindu here. We're trying to see the Hindu as on the verge of eternal damnation unless they reject Hinduism and embrace Christianity, embrace the God of the Bible. And so what do we say to the Hindu? This can be a little bit confusing, a little bit difficult, but it really does simplify in the end. And so we'll spend the next few minutes trying to get through the confusing part and get to the simplified part. If you do any research into Hinduism, you're going to read things like Hinduism is the world's oldest religion. Hinduism is the world's oldest religion. It's the third largest religion. Hinduism dates back over 4,000 years. It has no single founder and no definite starting point. Now that makes it sound like Hinduism is this unified system of belief that makes up the Hindu religion. And that's not true at all. And that probably is a big reason for the difficulty in researching Hinduism and figuring out what is Hinduism, because you approach it as if it's this singular, unified, monolithic system of beliefs, and that's just not true. It turns out Hinduism is a British term that was derived in the 19th century, the 1800s, that was sort of a catch-all phrase or a catch-all word name for the many, 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 many different religions found in the Indian subcontinent. It's just a kind of an umbrella phrase that describes all of the different religions that are found in India. Now, there's a lot of similarities between them, but there's a lot of differences also. And by differences, those differences can even be contradictory. There are Hindus who are atheists. There are Hindus who are theists, polytheists. So there is a wide diversity of thought within Hinduism. So that's first. It's just not proper to think, okay, I've got my head wrapped around Hinduism, because there are hundreds of variations of what can be termed Hinduism. And so you might think, well, how could I have an apologetic against something that's so widely variable? In the overlap, there are some commonalities that, generally speaking, you could say most Hindus ascribe to. And so we'll look at some of those. In Hinduism, there are 330 million different gods. 330 million different gods. We're not going to go through those this morning. People who call themselves Hindus number roughly 1.15 billion people. That's about 15% of the world's population. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. Now, of that 1.15 billion people, roughly 95% of those live in India. I think the percentage of the Oklahoma population who call themselves Hindu is 0.49%. Less than 0.5% of the Oklahoma population. That's about 19,000 people. Now, we were saying earlier, it's probably not likely that anybody here knows any Hindus. It's probably likely that you may not, in your circle of life, and you may not encounter a Hindu. But what you may encounter is somebody who's been influenced by Hinduism, and they don't even know it. There are Christians who have been influenced by Hinduism, and they don't even know it. There is a strong influence in our American culture from Hinduism, not just Hinduism by itself, but just Eastern philosophy. Faith Ann.
In yoga, the namaste, that means the light within you. I see the light within you. You see the light within me. That's a spiritual term. No, namaste.
Right. That's a perfect starting point to talk about the influence that these Eastern religions have had on American culture. Yoga studios are just about as numerous as the marijuana shops are in Oklahoma. You can't swing a cat without hitting a yoga studio. They're everywhere. Well, I'm sure none of us were alive, or if we were, no, I'm pretty sure none of us would have been alive at the time. None of us here. When the Beatles came back from India, they stepped off the plane and their guru was there with them. They introduced Eastern philosophy into America in a very, very powerful way. They're the Beatles, and so whatever the Beatles do has got to be cool. Well, they stepped off the plane. When that happened, it would have been virtually unheard of to have a yoga studio down the street from your house. And I'm not saying single-handedly they introduced this Eastern way of life into America, but they had a big hand in changing American culture using this Eastern philosophy. Anybody know the song by George Harrison, My Sweet Lord? Toe tapping song. And if we could put it on, I'm not going to, but if we put it on, everybody would recognize it because it's all over the radio. It's been on the radio forever. And it's a catchy tune. Well, guess what? He's not singing about Jesus. He's singing about Krishna, one of these Hindu gods. And he says it at the end of the song. He says, Hare Krishna. He's singing about a Hindu god. And we've just embraced George Harrison and his music and his Eastern thought. What about any George Strait fans in the audience? All My Exes Live in Texas. Everybody know that song? What does he say in that song? Anybody remember? by transcendental meditation? I go there each night. Transcendental meditation. George Strait is singing about transcendental meditation in one of his biggest hits. In 1987, there was a television miniseries called Out on a Limb, where Shirley MacLaine, standing on the beach, singing, "I am God, I am God, I am God." Is anybody familiar with that? It's talked about in our culture especially by Christians, as a purposeful act to help normalize these Eastern ways of thinking about things. What about the band Nirvana? What's Nirvana? Anybody know what Nirvana is? That's, you could say, in our parlance, you could say that's heaven for Hindus. Not that there is we should be careful as Christians to try to translate our way of thinking about these things just horizontally. There's differences in the way they would talk about quote unquote heaven or nirvana. But rock and roll band called Nirvana, one of the greatest rock and roll bands ever that everybody loves. Well, that is an influence from Hinduism. How about the Matrix trilogy? The Matrix movies. I really like those movies, especially the first one. Heavily influenced by these Eastern mystic religions like Hinduism. And when we get into some of what Hinduism teaches, maybe you'll be able to see some of that in the Matrix movies next time you see those or watch those. So let's talk a little bit about what, in general, most Hindus have in common as far as what they believe. They like us have scriptures. Now, they think about their scriptures differently than we think about our scriptures. So it's not a one-to-one comparison, but they have what you might call holy books or holy scriptures. There are the four Vedas. We're not going to get into what they're called and what all they say. They have the Bhagavad Gita. There's another example of how Hinduism has influenced our culture. There's a song by Ben Folds. Anybody know Ben Folds? He's got a song that talks about the Bhagavad Gita. That's a Hindu scripture. They have divine revelation. And so that'll come up at the end of this. How do we, because Linda pointed out last week when we were talking about the Muslims, well, we've got our holy book, they've got their holy book, and so it would appear that we're at an impasse. We can appeal to our holy book, and they can appeal to their holy book, and there we are stuck. How do we overcome that? And so the same thing holds with Hinduism. They have their divine revelation, we have our divine revelation. And it would appear that we're just at an impasse. That's just not true. And we saw that with the Quran. Their Quran is its own undoing in saying that the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, are revelations from Allah, and they are to be trusted in by the people group that they were given to. So We're not at an impasse with the Muslims. Well, the same is true for the Hindu scriptures. We're not as Christians, we're not at an impasse there. We'll get to that. Hindus, for the most part, believe in reincarnation. They would call that samsara. That's the term that they would use, samsara. What that's talking, everybody know what reincarnation is? Don't need to go into great detail. There is a cycle of life that we're all on, and we've lived many, many, many lives, and we will live many, many more lives. And when you die, you'll be reincarnated, and you'll either be reincarnated up a level or up multiple levels, or you'll be reincarnated down a level or multiple levels, meaning that whatever existence that you have now on this cycle of life, it might get better in the next life, or it might get worse in the next life. And that is dependent on how you behave in this life. So if you misbehave in this life, you might come back as a dung beetle next time. If you do good things, virtuous things, you might come back as something, maybe still a human, but maybe a prince or a queen. And so your existence will be better. That's samsara. That's the cycle of life. That's reincarnation.
It's interesting too how that belief in reincarnation, how that aids their caste system, and how it aids the validity of the caste system.
Yes. Can you describe for everybody the caste system?
Caste system. So I think there's maybe five castes. I haven't looked at it, but they're different levels. So, say my father was born unto a, brick mason type caste, right? Well, I could never get out of that caste, right? I could never get out of that level. So say the next level up is like attorneys, where you can have that job. Like I could never go to be an attorney because I was in this bricklaying caste. Then below that might be like the sanitation workers, right? Like that. And those people can never get out of that, aside from dying and being reincarnated, living a good life down there, dying, being reincarnated into an upper caste. So what it does is it gives the people at the top almost a deity. They are up there because they have done so good in their past lives.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And you're not allowed to marry outside of your caste system, whatever caste you were born into. So you're just stuck. In this life, you're just stuck. And so if you want out of the awfulness of your existence, if you want a better existence, you better do good. You better do good things. And they would call that karma. And there's good karma and there's bad karma. Now, those words are probably familiar to most everybody here. Karma, good karma, bad karma, because you may not know a Hindu, but I bet you know somebody who believes in karma. And possibly reincarnation, likely reincarnation. They're not Hindus, but they embrace those ideas. And so you do something good, you get good karma. You do something bad, you get bad karma. And all of that builds up merit or demerit in a person's life. And if you've got enough merit, enough good karma, when you are reincarnated, you'll get bumped up to a better existence. But if you've got too much bad karma, you get bumped down into a worse existence. And so what the Hindu is primarily focused on is what they would call moksha. Moksha. That is salvation. For the Hindu, that's what they're interested in, is salvation or moksha. And that is not salvation like you and I would think about salvation. It is being liberated from that cycle of life, life, death, and rebirth, reincarnation. If I'm a Hindu, I don't want to be reincarnated over and over and over and over and over again. I want off of that cycle. I want off of that wheel of life. I want to finally achieve liberation from that never-ending cycle. That's what the Hindu's interested in. Now, let me read something. Some Hindus have used the illustration of a drop of water falling out of the sky over the ocean. While that drop is falling, it is an individual drop with unique characteristics like no other drop in the world. It has a unique weight, density, shape, taste, color, and even smell, though the way in which each of these is different from those of other drops is infinitesimally small. Nevertheless, it is a drop like no other in the world. So it is a distinct individual drop. Yet when that drop hits the surface of the ocean, in less than a second, it loses its individuality. The drop of water dropping out of the sky into the ocean causes that drop to lose its individuality and become part of the one thing that is the ocean. No longer does it have a shape or weight or density. Now the atoms of that drop are dispersed throughout the ocean. Does the drop still exist? Yes and no. It does not exist as a drop with individuality. It has been absorbed into the oneness of the ocean. That's salvation for the Hindu. This individuality that I've got right now is something to be escaped, something to be liberated from. And I as a Hindu want to be reabsorbed into the oneness. Okay? That's salvation for the Hindu.
So that's like a lot about like being one with the earth,
Yep.
one with the environment, all is one kind of thing.
That's exactly right. All is one. And we're all being tricked by our eyes to see ourselves as individuals. That's the wrong way of looking at reality for the Hindu. The Hindu is trying to see reality as it really is. And as it really is, all is one. It doesn't look like all is one. So here I am sitting in this chair, and I'm separate and distinct from this chair. The Hindu says, no, you're not. You and that chair are one. You're part of the one. And it's an illusion that you are distinct from this chair. This table is not distinct from me. You are not distinct from me. You are not distinct from me. We're all one. And we've been fooled into believing otherwise, the Hindu says.
You know, this does have a big influence. If you even think about it, like, think about that movie Interstellar, right? Where it's like everything that has happened or will happen is happening all at the same time, like when he's in that tesseract, right? So he can look through his life at any point, like everything that has happened is happening. Like there is no chronology to it.
Right. Yep. And therefore no distinctions. That's huge in Hinduism.
No accountability.
Yep. Ultimately, no. That's exactly right. And that is one of the ways that we will engage the Hindu, is exactly what you just said. So we exist, Faith Ann.
Do the people who believe in reincarnation, do they claim to know they're if they're in a reincarnated state, like what they were before?
Some people claim to know what they were before in a previous life. Yeah. So we all exist in the realm of Maya. That's the realm of illusion. We are living in a way where we don't see reality. We live in the Maya, the realm of illusion. There are levels to reality. There's more real and less real. We tend to think real and unreal. That's just it. Hindus don't think that way. They think that there are levels of reality, and there's ultimate reality. And let's say you had a dream last night, and you're being chased by a bad guy in the dream. Now, you wake up and you think to yourself, oh, that was just a dream. That wasn't real. The Hindu would say, no, that was real. That the bad guy chasing you in the dream, that was real. It's maybe less real than ultimate reality, but it's still real. That's hard to understand, but that is how Hindus think. Levels of reality, and the realm that we're living in is real, but it's on a lower level of reality, and it's all illusion. And so the Hindu is striving for enlightenment, to see reality in a more real way, in an ultimate way, eventually. Now, that ultimate reality they call Brahman. That is an impersonal force. That's not a personal God. Think of Brahman as the ocean that we talked about, the oneness. That's Brahman. And so the individual Hindu is the drop of water, excuse me, that exists on a lower level of reality, and they're trying to be reabsorbed into Brahman, the oneness, where they can finally leave behind their individuality. Because for them there are no distinctions. Any distinctions that we see are illusion, and everything is one. And so the Hindu believes that, lives their life that way to a degree, but they're striving to live it out more and more and more in being enlightened and seeing all of the different ways that they have seen distinctions in this realm of illusion. They want to do away with those distinctions because that gets them closer and closer and closer to the oneness. And so that must mean for the Hindu, humanity, my humanness should be thought of, if there's no distinctions and ultimate reality is the oneness of Brahman, then my humanity should be thought of as part of that. Because me as a consistent Hindu is trying to not see the distinction between me as an individual and the oneness of Brahman. I want those two things to come together. And only when they finally do fully come together will nirvana happen.
So how does that affect morality? What does it mean?
That's exactly right. We are going to get to that very, very shortly. Let me read a couple things. One of the modern popularizers of Hinduism, Sai Baba, writes, "You are the God of the universe." You truly are God. You are not man. You are God. That's why Shirley MacLaine was standing on the beach saying, I am God, I am God, I am God, because that's what Hinduism teaches. During transcendental meditation, one is advised to convince oneself, quote, I am the Son, I am the true Son. The whole universe moves by me and receives its existence from me. I was before the beginning of the world. I penetrate every atom and bring it into movement. Oh, how marvelous I am. I am the entire universe. Everything is in me. I am God. How could you think otherwise if you're an enlightened Hindu and you believe that all is one? You're just being faithful to Hinduism by seeing yourself as I am the one. I am everything. Now, my problem as a non-Hindu, according to a Hindu, my problem as a non-Hindu is that I still insist on seeing distinctions. And I would be well served in not doing that anymore. I shouldn't see a difference between me and this table, or me and this chair, or me and the trees, or me and you. I want to make no distinctions, and the degree to which I do that, the more enlightened I am, the Hindu would say about me. So I'm not enlightened at all because I insist on seeing all these distinctions in reality. Now, if there are no distinctions for Hinduism, if there are no distinctions, now we're going to get to the Christian apologetic. If there are no distinctions, then how is it that a Hindu insists on seeing a distinction between the Maya and the Brahman? The realm of illusion and real reality. Isn't that a distinction that they're making? So couldn't we as Christians ask the Hindu? The Hindu says, I need to achieve nirvana, and the only way to do that is to stop seeing distinctions. Well, then I'm in nirvana. I'm in nirvana now. Because if there are no distinctions, then there is no distinction between being in nirvana and not being in nirvana. It's illogical. Morality, the Bhagavad Gita, one of their scriptures teaches there's no distinction between good and evil. There's no true distinction between good and evil. And so, for the Hindu, we can ask them, one of our already familiar tools that we have in our apologetic toolbox, you're saying there's good karma and there's bad karma. What are we going to ask them? How do we judge that? How do we judge what's good karma and bad karma? By what standard? If there are no distinctions, why are we making a distinction between good karma and bad karma? That's a distinction. And the Bhagavad Gita teaches not to make a distinction, or that there is no true distinction between good and evil. So how does the Hindu determine what is good karma? What is bad karma? It is the case, and I've heard a Hindu say this. It is the case that if you start arguing with a Hindu in these ways, they will say, well, you're too influenced by Western ways of thinking, which is why you're so interested in things like logic, the rules of logic. That's a Western way of thinking about things. We don't use that kind of way of thinking. There is a massive difference between an Eastern way of thinking and a Western way of thinking, and they know it, and we tend to not know it. But they will say logic is a Western way of thinking. And so what are you going to say? No, it isn't. No, it isn't. Logic is not a Western way of thinking. And you're not just saying that because logic is not merely a Western way of thinking. You're saying that for the irony of it. They're saying, they're making an argument using logic to say that's a Western way of thinking. And so because they have removed logic from their way of doing things, they're not able to then make an argument. And so you can say, no, logic is not a Western way of thinking. And you're disallowed from arguing with me. Because if you try to make an argument, now you're using logic. So you're stuck. You're stuck if you're a Hindu. And that is the way that we're not at an impasse. We're not at an impasse. They've got their holy book. They've got their sacred scriptures. We've got ours. And they would say, well, you've got yours. We've got ours. They think theirs is better. And we say, no, ours is better. And so there's the impasse. That's not at all what we believe about our book. Our book is not on the same level as their book or books. Their book reduces to illogical, irrational ways of thinking about things. It reduces to absurdity. That's our apologetic, that God has revealed himself in this book, not in your book. And unless you embrace this book, you are reduced to absurdity. You can't use logic. You have no way of coming to an understanding of what right and wrong is. And so your whole system breaks down. It is what Paul wrote of in 1 Corinthians. We've looked at this before. This is our apologetic. This is the way in which we're doing apologetics, by being biblical. And we're using Paul to do it. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18 and down through verse 21, for the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. That's what God has provided to us Christians. He's provided his word that destroys anything that's not submitted to his revelation of himself. Paul goes on, where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? That's our argument to the Hindu. You are reduced to foolishness by believing in the Eastern way of believing. You can't make sense out of anything if you're a Hindu. You can't make an argument if you're a Hindu. Now, they will make an argument, but that's what we're trying to do, is to point out that they're being not just inconsistent, they are being inconsistent, but they're being foolish. They've been reduced to foolishness by believing what they believe. Let's take a break.